This is part 3 in a series of videos in which I'm attempting to recreate the functionality of these ROM card modules for the 9830A desktop calculator. The modules provide various software options for the calculator, and the modules are quite expensive and hard to find, and it's kind of best if they are found to try and preserve them. They obviously are susceptible to failure, and so the idea is to make the code as accessible as possible to anyone that owns one of these machines. And so the idea is to replace the mask ROMs that are in the original modules with a more modern EEPROM, and also using a bigger EEPROM it will be possible to have multiple images in a single EEPROM on a single card. Now it will only provide the functionality of a single module at any one time, but what I'm going to do is put some switches down the back of the card, and then you can just select whichever image you want. So you can, in theory, put all the images for all possible modules into a single card, and then select the one that you want. Have multiple cards, and just select the different modules for each one, and you can have the whole set without having to go to the time, trouble and expense of trying to track down and purchase one of the originals. So what I've done so far is put together a test jig that I showed in the previous video that allowed me to read an original card. That worked fine. So the next step was to start putting together the design for the replacement card, and that will plug into the same adapter. So effectively the programmer is simulating the 9830A, and if it can read the card and get the data out of it, then in theory what we need is to duplicate that functionality with our test jig. So if I can get this working, then I can turn this into a simple card. Now, part of the design I'm going for is to keep as fewer components on my replacement card as possible, and that's to keep the cost down, keep it as simple as possible, so that if you need multiple cards you don't have to spend hours building each one and putting loads of components on there. So what I've got so far is the ROM. I will be using two different types of ROM footprint for the card. There will be this larger 16-bit ROM, but also I will include the option to fit two 8-bit ROMs instead. This means that when you program them you'll have to split the data into two groups. So what I've got in this ROM is the data that I extracted from this card. Have checked it, it's 100% accurate and correct with regards to the data that's available in the online emulator for the 9830, so I've checked it against those files and it seems to be correct. The data is of course inverted, but then it is in these cards, so what I need is for whatever this spits out to be exactly the same as what this spits out. Doesn't matter if it's inverted or backwards, as long as what's coming into the programmer is the same, because that's what the 9830A is going to see. So I've got this hooked up to the bench power supply still, so the power for this is not coming from the programmer, it's still coming from the test jig I've got set up here, and again that's to make sure that our test is as valid as possible to make it appear like the 9830. So I've now got this hooked up. I've got the address lines hooked up, I've got the data lines connected, and I've got the control lines set. And the only complication of course is that three of the control lines are 12 volt signals coming in, which I've simulated with the this kind of test jig I've got set up here. And so there needs to be some level shifters to shift that level down to the TTL values that the EEPROM needs. That's what I've got hooked up on the scope. Just looking at one of those lines, the yellow trace is connected to the chip enable line for the EEPROM. So we've got 12 volt signal coming in, but it needs to be sort of 4 or 5 volts going into the EEPROM. So very simple level shifters. You can see, I don't know if you can see, there's a series of small jumpers here. They're just connecting the unused address lines on the EEPROM to ground. and they would normally be connected in my final design to some DIB switches, so you'll be able to select the different banks. So I'll be dividing the EEPROM into 1K blocks. That will give more than enough room in a single EEPROM for every single available type of module. So that's really all that's in here. There's a bit of complication, of course, because we've got this split address 8 line very easily taken care of, and then it's just really making sure that we've got the sense of the signals correct. The only complication here is that one of the lines is inverted, so I'm probably going to need to put an inverter on the module card, but I'm seeing if there's a way around that at the moment, but I suspect not. It's just that the way that some of the signals work on here is the inverse of the way that they work in the actual 9830. But I'll look into that in more detail, but I've got it set up in a similar way to the, or an identical way to the 9830 at the moment. Data lines just come straight out and go into what would be the 9830, and in the actual machine they then go into some buffers before they go into the main data bus. So what we'll do now is try reading this. As before, I'll pull up a close-up of the programmer in the left-hand corner of the screen. I'll now power up the test jig. So we've just got noise on here at the moment because it's kind of floating. It wouldn't actually be floating in the actual machine, but in this test jig it is, because there's no kind of back end to it. There's no actual machine there. Okay, so now we'll try reading the data from the EEPROM. So now you see that the control signal is correct, and it's also the correct amplitude. Okay, and if we go in and look at the data we've just captured, and what we're interested in here is, as we were in the previous video, the last 2 bytes, because they represent the first 2 bytes. Although it's backwards, it was when we read this, so as long as it's backwards in with this jig as well, then we know it's doing exactly the same thing as the original module. So as we can see, we're getting exactly the same values. I won't go through the conversion again, but you can see here that the hex value is the same as it was when we read this card. So we're getting 93F6 for the last one, which is actually the first byte that the 9830 would see, and then 93E1 for the one before that, which again is the same as we got with the actual card. So this is working fine at the moment, and as I said, I just need to resolve the issue of the inverted chip enable line, and worst case it's just putting a small buffer on the card, so it's not going to make a huge complication to it. But once I've done that, I can start laying out the board, and I'm going to do a bit more testing with it, but it certainly looks like it's going to work so far. And the only thing that will complicate matters is when you program the EEPROM, you'll need to invert the data, or at least reverse the data and then invert it. Another option is just to make a test jig like this and read the original card, and that will automatically give you exactly what needs to be programmed into the EEPROM when not inverting it. In other words, you read it out, it will be inverted. Program it directly as it comes out into the new EEPROM, and then that will give you exactly what you need when you put the EEPROM into the card. Okay, so it appears to be working, making good progress. It looks like the next step in the next video will be to start work on the actual card itself, and then that should be fairly easy. It shouldn't take more than an hour or two to lay that out. Very simple card. Okay, so in the next video I'll start looking at laying out the actual card, the PCB. It should be fairly straightforward, not many components to go on it. Just the added complication, which will be minor, of having 2 different types of EEPROM, but that's just a simple layout task. And all I need to do is resolve the issue of possibly needing the inverter, but worst case that's just putting a 7404 onto the board and inverting it, adding some dip switches, and that's pretty much it. A few decoupling caps. What I'll be doing as well is plugging this into the 9830 and making sure that it gives us the functionality of the original module, and assuming all that works, I can go ahead, get some boards ordered, make some prototypes up, program the EEPROM with various images and see if that works. So it's looking like we're making good progress here. It's not going to be too much longer before we can start testing actual cards.